desert in the building with so many people, but that's okay. I actually have the pleasure of rounding out this discussion by focusing almost exclusively on the international affairs of Uzbekistan after Karimov. Bruce has looked at the regional issues, which I will touch on, or I'll get back to with some few comments, but I would stress almost, if you want to say bottom line up front, that is going to be the dominant area of engagement for the new administration in Tashkent. I should also say, especially what we've just heard and what we'll hear later this afternoon, the domestic matters are going to be important. Economic development, trade, stability, these are going to be critical. And so, when we look at this transition, and we look at the coming months, and I would say, if you want, the short to medium term, we have to really be careful in terms of how we want to see the government in Tashkent prioritize things. Now, what I would say, and in terms of foreign policy and in terms of how we engage, this is an exercise that is done internationally. In fact, right now, for your reading pleasure, Chatham House is doing a series of policy papers comparing foreign policy strategies in different areas depending on who wins in our election in November. What does it mean for relations with Russia? Hint, hint, one is bad, one is good. What does it mean for relations in the Middle East, etc.? But this ultimately is speculation because we have to look at a few key factors. First of all, what's already on the ground? And in the case of Uzbekistan, we do have a foreign policy elite or a foreign policy structure that largely manages international affairs. I mean, as with many countries, it's the domain of a small group of people. And in this instance, of course, it's a small group of people whose decisions ultimately have to get the approval of the president. And so we simply transition over to a new president. How much authority is he willing to assert in the realm of foreign policy? Now, we know in the past there have been officials that we outsiders like to deem either this one is pro-US or this one is pro-Russia, but at the end of the day, the element that they all hold is that they were loyal to the president. And we'll have to see in the transition as we have interim President Mirziyoyev, are they loyal to him, and then after the election in December, and if one assumes that he wins the election, will they remain loyal? We have, for example, the foreign minister Kamilov, who's been around for some time. In his recent posting, he's been there since January 2012, but let's not forget, he held that position from 1994 to 2003, which were incredibly important years for Uzbek foreign and security policy. This is when they were dealing with transnational threats coming across the border. This is when they're really dealing with multi-level relations with the West to include security ties. And of course, the beginning of the Afghanistan mission, the joining of the SCO. In short, a person who's done quite a bit. Now, the question would be, will he remain in office, or will this be a casualty of a transition? That's something we'll note in just a second. But second, we also have a continuity in policy. I mean, there's an established foreign policy structure or document that interim President Mirziyoyev has acknowledged. And he states, that in fact the foreign policy of Uzbekistan is based on the concept of foreign policy of the Republic of Uzbekistan, among others. And this is an important document or an important point to note, because we have an emphasis really on pragmatic foreign policy courses, as is quoted, that requires timely and adequate responses to emerging challenges. If we want to say it's realpolitik in action, that's not a bad way to look at it. And really, to sort of quote directly, the main goals of the foreign policy of the Republic of Uzbekistan are further strengthening of independence and sovereignty of the state. And it goes on, but that's the important phrase to note. We're really looking at sovereignty, and we're really looking at this identity that Uzbekistan holds. And so, at least in the short to medium term, we're going to see this continued. Now, to assess the future, of course, it is educated guesswork. As I've said, when we start looking at who's coming in, and whether we look at it as political analysts and pundits would do in other countries, or we don our dusty criminological hats and try to figure out palace intrigue and clan rivalries and all that. I recall writing on the emergence of this new leader as First Secretary, Islam Karimov, a few years ago. I guess I should say in the 1980s, and so it's no surprise that some analysis is done using this approach. Now, what I would say is we need to err on the side of caution when we do this. If we see a political figure demoted, is it because of a personal vendetta? And I think actually the cases that Bruce noted are probably good examples of just that. But when we see transitions taking place at the senior level, new individuals coming in who might either be, open to trade agreements, open to relations with the West, open to stronger ties with Russia, we might want to sort of closely look as to perhaps why that individual is important and what they hold for this new president or this new administration. And I would just say as well, for the foreign policy elite, we're seeing now a series of events here in the United States and elsewhere where the continuation model is being emphasized. Former Foreign Minister Sadiq Safaev's visit to the U.S. This past week, events here in Washington as well as other places which note that we have this continuation taking place. So at least I could say, end of presentation, there's continuity. Well, what I'd like to do is look at a few specific areas to highlight perhaps where we have some nuanced challenges. And of course we have this in the realm of concentric circles, right? The immediate neighborhood, the neighbors of Uzbekistan, how might policy change towards them? The other Eurasian states, to include Russia, as noted. What about relations with Asia and China in particular? And then what about relations with the West? And I would say the US in particular. And each of these instances, we're going to see, I think, some interesting developments take place. First, in terms of the immediate neighborhood, I don't have to repeat what Bruce said. I thought that was a wonderful way to capture the specific bilateral dynamics at play. Most in the room here who follow Central Asian politics know that the foreign dynamics in the region aren't the best. This is one of the least integrated regions in the world. South Asia sometimes likes to hold itself as the model of least integrated, but other areas have this moniker as well, and we know the reasons, right? I mean, whether it's personal challenges, whether it's border disputes, whether it's ethnic challenges, a host of reasons that have come into play. Outside forces meddling, on occasion that argument is used, but I would say ultimately these end up becoming internal issues. My point, though, would be that if we see these bilateral ties improve step by step, bilateral ties with Tajikistan, bilateral ties with Kyrgyzstan, they're done in a transactional way. It's not because of a desire to see unity in Central Asia. We are not going to see a return of the various alphabet soups of regional organizations that developed in the 1990s and all sort of withered away. It's going to be transactional relationships that at least both sides see are somewhat beneficial to them. In the case of Uzbekistan, we could easily see an opportunity for increased trade. This may help stabilize economic issues or challenges in the country. It may lessen some pressures in border areas. And at least for these four neighbors, the four post-Soviet neighbors, if you want to say, we can see this go. And particularly, I would argue, with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, we have a real opportunity to look at lessening some tensions over longer-term issues that are still going to vex these countries. We're not going to solve the Rogun Dam problem anytime soon, and Mirziyoyev or other individuals in that office are going to have to work on that issue for quite a while, because even though construction is slowed down, largely because of financing and resources, and there's obviously reevaluation of environmental impacts, it's moving ahead. And so it's going to take some time if, in fact, there's been agreement on an issue that both sides are unquestionably at opposite sides. But I would add one other neighbor, and that, of course, is that fifth Central Asia, the non-CIS one, well, the non-Eurasian one, which is Afghanistan. Now, President Karimov was greatly concerned about instability coming northward. And in fact, that small 158-kilometer border is one of the more, if you want to say, heavily defended, heavily guarded in the region. There also were questions of the instability and the legitimacy of the government, of the Karzai regime, and now I would argue the Ghani Abdullah regime. Will President Mirziyoyev try to enhance ties with this country? In the last few years, there was an effort to link it together through some sort of, northern distribution network, so-called New Silk Road, Modern Silk Road. Odds are that process is largely dead. The parties involved, particularly the Russian connection, is not exactly cooperative to American trade interests, and so we're seeing other dynamics adversely affect these regional affairs. But this doesn't change the fact that Uzbekistan still sees this southernmost neighbor as a serious security problem for them. If they truly want to develop a multi-vectored approach and look at these new states through new lenses, will we see this new lens applied southward? No answer as of yet, but I would argue that that's an area that I would look at in the next few years. Actually sooner than that, because the problems in Afghanistan are getting worse, not better. In terms of the other CIS states, continuity will remain the same, at least in the short and long term. Expect to see continued silence or ambivalence on issues such as Georgia-Russia disputes, Ukraine-Russia disputes. We'll see concerns and expressions of concern about the loss of life, about the continued violence, and perhaps most importantly, the desire to seek resolution through either bilateral negotiations or acceptable multilateral forums, such as the United Nations, couched and, I would say, phrased very specifically. This is what has been said in the past. I would expect this to continue. With respect to Russia, I agree with Bruce on this. We see some ties developing. Now, it's fascinating because in the past, obviously month plus, we've had some commentaries talk about the potential of Russian intervention in case of instability and violence in Uzbekistan. We've not seen that, therefore would we then not have intervention? Possible. I actually see this as a continuation of status quo. If we think about it, take a step back. From Uzbekistan's point of view, this getting close to Russia, distancing, getting close to Russia, distancing based on specific issues and events, quite frankly, that's settled down a bit. And now there is a more, I would call it, realistic view of what role each other plays to the other state. And likewise, I would argue in the case of Russia, interestingly. President Putin correctly expressed his condolences for the death of President Karimov, reiterated his favorable view of Uzbekistan, in fact, used the wonderful phrase, most reliable friend. He will repeat this several times. Now, whether we believe it or not is immaterial. What we do see is that Russia simply wants to see Uzbekistan not moving further away, but remain within this rather tricky orbit of Eurasian states. And it's doing just that. Uzbekistan can continue a multi-vector foreign policy, and quite frankly, we don't see the same tensions and drama that we have with a Georgia, with a Ukraine, among others. This is quite frankly, it's in the interest of both states, and so again, continuity prevails. And then as we move to the last regions, what does this say about Asia or China in particular, perhaps? Again, when we look in the economic realm, where the interests more or less largely lie, we see progress development. In fact, shortly after the death of President Karimov, we have a trade agreement with South Korea enhancing an already interesting and I would argue robust dynamic. And no surprise, China is continuing its economic development opportunities and investment opportunities. What I would say is unlike the neighbor to the south, when we look at Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan has always been rather cagey about putting too many eggs in the Chinese basket, not wanting to be beholden to them for trade routes, for energy routes, etc. But they do remain all the same a rather significant trade partner. And what's most important in this dynamic, and what we've already heard from the Chinese side, is one, President Xi Jinping announcing and declaring his sympathy for the country of Uzbekistan at the loss of their president, but also stressing that its adherence to the non-interference of states in the internal affairs of others. This mantra that's heard in the region repeatedly, unlike a view expressed by other countries, which we'll get to in just a second, is key, because it offers really a philosophical, or I would say foundation, to what you do in your country is going to stay in your country, so to speak. And what Dilaram says, these sorts of issues and challenges are not going to be criticized by the neighbors. The countries I've mentioned are not going to address the issues you're raising. That's going to be left to the West, which is the last area I'll look at, and which I would argue is perhaps the more problematic one as we look ahead in this new administration. Because, you know, I've used the word tricky, I've used the word testy, and they all can apply to the West in the region, right? You know, we're dealing with countries that express a desire to engage with Uzbekistan. In fact, there's a senior delegation, Undersecretary for Policy, Tom Shannon, is, I believe, in Tashkent today. So, you know, the highest ranking person in some time, C5+1, is a policy proposal that the U.S. really does believe in, that the U.S. State Department wants to see developed. So we have this, and yet at the same time we raise concerns on issues of human rights, civil society, NGOs, etc. This dichotomy is going to continue, and I would argue could actually become even more problematic in the next, if you want to say, short to medium term. You know, I mentioned that we've already had the visits here of Uzbek officials. There's been an opening, at least, to say and to pass on the message: we are stable, we are open for business. You know, this is a new era, so to speak, and yet things are the same. It's always good to be new and changing at the same time. Our reaction has been mixed. You know, we've had these high-level visits, but what I would argue the two areas that we need to be concerned about most are going to keep it a problematic dynamic. You know, when asked the question, do you think that U.S.-Uzbek relations could improve, and I'll focus specifically on the U.S. as representative of the West, do you think they could improve in this post-Karimov era? The answer is going to probably be a fairly lukewarm, maybe to a no. I actually don't see improvement taking place, in part because the concerns raised about the internal dynamics of Uzbekistan still remain. A new leader, is he going to see these points any differently? Not likely. And in fact, the perception that the U.S. is meddling in the internal affairs of Uzbekistan, that the U.S. is trying to pressure value systems that are not applicable in the region, are going to continue. And I would argue that in many ways these are incredibly important factors when looking at the broader relationship. The U.S. doesn't offer a good deal of economic assistance, and I would argue a great presence in the country, even in terms of security. So the ability to sort of raise these other concerns, they don't hold much water. Again, the transactional dynamic isn't as prevalent here. But the second, as well, is we're going to probably see a continued series of miscommunications, misperceptions, and flare-ups. You know, traditionally, U.S. officials, and this is simply speaking as myself, not as in any representative of the U.S. government, U.S. officials do tend to look down on their Uzbek counterparts. And it's not a grand revelation from WikiLeaks. We're not allowed to read those, or the like. But the fact that Americans see this as an area where we can get them to think like us. We can get them to change. And it's a song, so to speak, that's been sung for 25 years, and one that doesn't resonate as well in the region, at least among the governments or the leaderships of the region. In terms of security cooperation, we emphasize a certain brand of defense institution building and cooperation that really says, follow a model that may not be applicable to your needs. And it's no surprise that in any of these discussions and at all levels, we still deal with issues of the domestic dynamics in Uzbekistan. And in short, you know, if we talk about transparency, reciprocity, and the like, those sorts of terms and phrases don't resonate well in the region. Will a new leader change any of this? And in the short term, it's doubtful, because these dynamics are systemic. What we've seen in the past, what has jolted relations between the West, and I would say specifically the U.S. and Uzbekistan, have been significant events, like 9/11, and then the subsequent campaign in Afghanistan, like Andijan, and the subsequent freezing of relations between the two states. It almost takes something like that to put a shock in the system, a shock in the relationship. And until then, what we're seeing is really a slow drift. U.S. policy is there, engagement is there, but if you look at the breadth of engagement, it unfortunately isn't what it used to be in terms of the NGO presence, in terms of the associations and organizations and businesses in the region. It doesn't mean that the U.S. has no role, but the U.S. is still going to be challenged in terms of how it views its relationship with Uzbekistan, and I would argue beyond into the current administration. So to conclude, well, what things could change? What could jolt this relationship? quite frankly, other than a serious existential threat. You know, a concern coming from the South, a discussion of foreign fighters and all that, which are the topics of other panels, not this one. You know, ultimately, this has nothing to do with the new leader. In fact, what we're going to see is a continuation of a rather suspicious look across the boundaries from the US to Uzbekistan and back, which perhaps I don't want to say isn't a bad thing. It's better to accept a reality that at least we can understand. What we can see, though, where we will see changes, and where perhaps the leader himself, as a new person in the scene, can change things, is exactly what we just witnessed, or what we've seen over the last few weeks with respect to the neighborhood, which makes sense. And again, as I kind of conclude, I would say, when I look at an individual coming in who largely has had his experience coming of age during the dismantling of the Soviet Union, taking local positions, in fact had the chance to interview him when he was Hakim in Samarkand, and then later taking on a prime ministership position where really he focused on the cadres within the regions, in the Vilayat, I should say. He really hasn't dealt with a lot of foreign policy affairs, and it's not going to remain a priority for him. The goal is really to hold things stable. The goal is really to make sure there's continuity in relations with Russia, in relations with China, in relations to other states in the world. A gradual enhanced attendance in multinational organization meetings, UN summits, and the like. We'll see this develop over time. By the way, that's nothing new for presidents who've come into power with the same sort of background. Whether it's a Western president, you know, an Asian president, an African president, if a person who comes into power largely has domestic concerns and interests, that's what they're going to focus on. But the area where they can perhaps have the greatest value, the bang for their buck, so to speak, in foreign affairs, will be the immediate neighborhood, because it will allow them to get things done at home. And so, to conclude, I would say, we're looking at a guy, if we assume it's Mirziyoyev, who's going to be learning on the job, who will focus on the short to medium term for foreign affairs, and will undoubtedly surprise us in the future. Theresa May is doing this in the UK, Justin Trudeau is doing this in Canada, and we'll see this in November with either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the US. So what I would say is there's always room for an affirmation of our views held, disappointment in bad decisions, or a pleasant surprise with any positive turn, depending on how we want to examine the facts. But let's do that during our questions. So I'll end here. Okay.